In 1982, Paul McCartney and Michael Jackson recorded 2 songs together at the Air Studios in London. The first was "The Girl Is Mine," which appeared on Michael Jackson's Thriller. The second was "Say, Say, Say," which came out the following year. The sessions were productive and, by all accounts, comfortable. 2 people who understood music at a high level working together without the specific friction that professional collaborations between people of that caliber sometimes produce. Between sessions, they talked about music, about the industry, about the specific mechanics of how the business around the music actually worked. Paul McCartney, in one of those conversations, told Michael Jackson something he had learned the hard way over the course of a career that began in the early 1960s and that had cost him, in the years since, a significant amount of money and control because he had not known it early enough. Own the publishing. Own the rights to the songs. That is where the real money is. And that is where the real control is. And if you do not own it, someone else does. And at some point you will want it back. And you will not be able to get it. Michael Jackson in 1982 was not simply a recording artist between albums. Thriller had not yet been released. The sessions at Air Studios were part of the preparation for what would become the best-selling album in history. But he was already someone who paid attention to the business around the music in ways that many performers of his generation did not. He had grown up in a family where the business decisions around the music were made by other people, first by his father, then by Motown, then by CBS, and he had developed in the years since leaving those structures a specific awareness of the gap between what an artist earned and what an artist was worth. He listened to what Paul McCartney told him about publishing rights with the specific attention of someone who is hearing something that confirms what they had already begun to understand. He asked questions. Paul answered them. The conversation was, by the account of people who were present, longer than the kind of conversation that happens casually between recording sessions. It was a real exchange, Paul explaining the mechanics, Michael absorbing them, both of them understanding that they were discussing something important. What Paul McCartney did not know in those recording sessions in 1982 was that Michael Jackson was going to apply what he learned with a thoroughness and speed that Paul had not anticipated. Michael was not just listening to understand how the music business worked in general. He was listening to understand how to act. There was a difference between the 2 kinds of listening, and it was not visible in the conversation. Paul McCartney understood what he was talking about, because he had experienced the specific pain of not owning what he had made. The Beatles' songs, the catalog that he and John Lennon and George Harrison and Ringo Starr had built over the decade between 1962 and 1970, one of the most commercially and artistically significant bodies of work in the history of popular music, were not owned by the people who had written them. The rights had been sold, transferred, and eventually acquired by a company called ATV Music Publishing, which held the Northern Songs catalog that included most of the Lennon-McCartney compositions. Paul McCartney had tried to buy it back. He had not been able to. The price had always been too high, the timing had always been wrong, or the owners had been unwilling. It was one of the defining frustrations of his professional life. The songs he had written with John Lennon were someone else's property, and he could not change that. When he told Michael Jackson about the importance of owning publishing rights, he was speaking from a place of genuine understanding. He was not offering abstract business advice. He was describing something he knew from the specific experience of not having done it and living with the consequences. The specific moment Paul McCartney learned about the purchase has been described in his own words in the years since. He learned about it, he said, from a phone call. He was told that Michael Jackson had purchased ATV Music Publishing and that the purchase included the Northern Songs catalog, which meant that Michael Jackson now owned the rights to Yesterday, Let It Be, Hey Jude, Come Together, and the majority of the songs Paul McCartney had written across the most important decade of his creative life. McCartney's initial response was, by his account, complicated. There was surprise, not that Michael had made the purchase necessarily, but at the speed with which he had moved and the completeness of the acquisition. There was something else, too. A recognition that the conversation in the studio in 1982 had been absorbed and applied in a way that had direct consequences for Paul McCartney himself. He had told Michael Jackson to own the publishing. Michael Jackson had owned the publishing. He had owned Paul McCartney's publishing. McCartney later said, in various interviews over the years, that he was not angry, or at least not only angry. He was also, he said, a little bit stunned. He had taught someone a lesson, and the lesson had been applied with perfect precision to the situation he had been trying to change for 20 years. The irony was not subtle. In 1984, ATV Music Publishing came up for sale. The catalog that ATV controlled included approximately 4,000 songs. Among them were the majority of the Lennon-McCartney compositions. The songs Paul McCartney had written with John Lennon that had been at the center of his professional life for 20 years and that he had been trying in various ways to recover or reacquire for much of that time. The asking price was $47.5 million. Paul McCartney was aware that the catalog was for sale. He was interested. He and Yoko Ono, John Lennon's widow, who had her own claim to and interest in the Lennon-McCartney songs, had discussions about jointly purchasing the catalog. Those discussions did not produce an agreement. The price was significant, the negotiations were complicated, and the specific dynamic between the various interested parties made a clean joint purchase difficult to achieve. Michael Jackson was also aware that the catalog was for sale. He had been advised by his attorney John Branca to pay close attention to music publishing acquisitions, and the ATV catalog was one of the most significant publishing portfolios that had come to market in decades. He moved with a speed and decisiveness that the other interested parties did not match. In August of 1985, Michael Jackson purchased ATV Music Publishing for $47.5 million. He now owned the rights to most of the songs Paul McCartney had written with John Lennon. There is a specific quality to this story that makes it more complicated than a simple business transaction. It is a story about knowledge and what happens when knowledge is transferred from one person to another in a context of trust, and then applied in a way that the person who shared it did not anticipate. Paul McCartney shared what he knew because he was, in that studio in 1982, in a collaborative and open frame of mind. He was working with Michael Jackson on music they were making together. He was not guarding his knowledge. He was offering it in the way that people who have hard-won experience sometimes offer it, freely, because they understand what it cost them not to have known it, and because they believe that sharing it is the right thing to do. Michael Jackson received it exactly as it was offered, as genuine, useful, hard-won knowledge that he was going to apply. What makes the story worth understanding is not the irony, though the irony is real and significant. What makes it worth understanding is what it reveals about Michael Jackson as a businessman, as someone who was not simply a performer who happened to be enormously successful, but someone who understood the structures around his work and who acted on that understanding with the same precision and commitment that he brought to the music itself. He had grown up in an industry that did not always treat its artists as full participants in the business decisions that shaped their careers. He had decided at some point that he was going to be a full participant. The relationship between Michael Jackson and Paul McCartney after 1985 was, by most accounts, strained. McCartney made no secret in later years of his feelings about the situation, that he had hoped Michael would give the songs back or sell them to him, that he found the experience of not owning his own work painful, that the specific irony of having taught Michael the rule that resulted in the purchase was not something he could fully set aside. Michael Jackson did not sell the catalog back. He held it, continued to develop it, and eventually merged the ATV catalog with Sony's Music Publishing division to create Sony/ATV Music Publishing, a joint venture that became one of the largest music publishers in the world. The professional relationship between the two men did not fully recover. They were cordial when circumstances required it, but the specific warmth of those 1982 sessions, the two of them between takes, talking about music and the business around it, the easy exchange of two people who understood what each other was doing, that warmth did not survive what happened in 1985. What the story reveals in the years since is something about both of them, about Paul McCartney, a man who had made the mistake of not owning his work and had spent years trying to undo it and had, in the end, watched someone else use the lesson he taught to complete the thing he was trying to prevent. About Michael Jackson, a man who listened to what people with knowledge told him, who absorbed it completely, who applied it without hesitation, and who understood that the business of music was as much a part of what he was doing as the music itself. The songs in the ATV catalog are still available. You can hear Yesterday and Hey Jude and Come Together on any platform that carries music. They are as present in the world now as they were when Paul McCartney and John Lennon wrote them, and they will be present long after the specific business arrangements around them have changed again, as they have changed and will continue to change in the way that all arrangements around significant creative work eventually change. Paul McCartney, in the years since 1985, has spoken about the situation in ways that range from resigned to wry. He has said that he wishes things had been different. He has said that Michael Jackson was a good businessman. He has said, in the specific way of someone who has spent decades processing something complicated, that it is what it is. Michael Jackson, in the years before he died in 2009, rarely spoke about the ATV purchase in terms of the Paul McCartney relationship. He spoke about it in terms of what he believed about music publishing, about artists owning their work, about the importance of control, about the specific lesson he had learned from the people he had worked with and the industry he had grown up in. The lesson Paul McCartney taught him was the right lesson. The lesson was, own what you make, own the rights, own the control. If you do not own it, someone else does. Michael Jackson had learned it. He had applied it. He had applied it completely. The songs are still playing. The lesson is still true. And the conversation in a London studio in 1982 between two men who did not yet know what it would set in motion is still the beginning of the story.